Summer, the classic story by Edith Wharton, Part 4, 12. One afternoon toward the end of August, a group of girls sat in a room at Miss Hatchard's in a gay confusion of flags, turkey red, blue, and white paper muslin, harvest sheaves, and illuminated scrolls. North Dormer was preparing for its Old Home Week. That form of sentimental decentralization was still in its early stages, and, precedents being few and the desire to set an example contagious, the matter had become a subject of prolonged and passionate discussion under Miss Hatchard's roof. The incentive to the celebration had come rather from those who had left North Dormer than from those who had been obliged to stay there, and there was some difficulty in rousing the village to the proper state of enthusiasm. But Miss Hatchard's pale, prim drawing room was the center of constant comings and goings from Hepburn, Nettleton, Springfield, and even more distant cities, and whenever a visitor arrived, he was led across the hall and treated to a glimpse of the group of girls deep in their pretty preparations. All the old names, all the old names. Miss Hatchard would be heard, tapping across the hall on her crutches. Targat, Solace, Fry. This is Miss Orma Fry sewing the stars on the drapery for the organ loft. Don't move, girls. And this is Miss Allie Hawes, our cleverest needlewoman. And Miss Charity Royall making our garlands of evergreen. I like the idea of it's all being homemade, don't you? We haven't had to call in any foreign talent. My young cousin Lucius Harney, the architect. You know he's up here preparing a book on colonial houses. He's taken the whole thing in hand so cleverly. But you must come and see his sketch for the stage we're going to put up in the town hall. One of the first results of the Old Home Week agitation had, in fact, been the reappearance of Lucius Harney in the village street. He had been vaguely spoken of as being not far off, but for some weeks past, no one had seen him at North Dormer, and there was a recent report of his having left Creston River, where he was said to have been staying, and gone away from the neighborhood for good. Soon after Miss Hatchard's return, however, he came back to his old quarters in her house and began to take a leading part in the planning of the festivities. He threw himself into the idea with extraordinary good humor and was so prodigal of sketches and so inexhaustible in devices that he gave an immediate impetus to the rather languid movement and infected the whole village with his enthusiasm. Lucius has such a feeling for the past that he has roused us all to a sense of our privileges, Miss Hatchard would say, lingering on the last word, which was a favorite one. And before leading her visitor back to the drawing room, she would repeat, for the 100th time, that she supposed he thought it very bold of little North Dormer to start up and have a home week of its own, when so many bigger places hadn't thought of it yet, but that, after all, associations counted more than the size of the population, didn't they? And of course North Dormer was so full of associations. Historic, literary, here a filial sigh for Honorius, and ecclesiastical. He knew about the old pewter communion service imported from England in 1769, she supposed. And it was so important in a wealthy materialistic age to set the example of reverting to the old ideals, the family and the homestead and so on. This peroration usually carried her halfway back across the hall, leaving the girls to return to their interrupted activities. The day on which Charity Royall was weaving hemlock garlands for the procession was the last before the celebration. When Miss Hatchard called upon the North Dormer maidenhood to collaborate in the festal preparations, Charity had at first held aloof, but it had been made clear to her that her non-appearance might excite conjecture, and reluctantly, she had joined the other workers. The girls, at first shy and embarrassed, and puzzled as to the exact nature of the projected commemoration, had soon become interested in the amusing details of their task, and excited by the notice they received. They would not for the world have missed their afternoons at Miss Hatchard's, and while they cut out and sewed and draped and pasted, their tongues kept up such an accompaniment to the sewing machine that Charity's silence sheltered itself unperceived under their chatter. In spirit, she was still almost unconscious of the pleasant stir about her. Since her return to the Red House, on the evening of the day when Harney had overtaken her on her way to the mountain, she had lived at North Dormer as if she were suspended in the void. She had come back there because Harney, after appearing to agree to the impossibility of her doing so, had ended by persuading her that any other course would be madness. She had nothing further to fear from Mr. Royall. Of this she had declared herself sure. though she had failed to add in his exoneration that he had twice offered to make her his wife. Her hatred of him made it impossible at the moment for her to say anything that might partly excuse him in Harney's eyes. Harney, however, once satisfied of her security, had found plenty of reasons for urging her to return. The first, and the most unanswerable, was that she had nowhere else to go. But the one on which he laid the greatest stress was that flight would be equivalent to avowal. If, as was almost inevitable, rumors of the scandalous scene at Nettleton should reach North Dormer, how else would her disappearance be interpreted? Her guardian had publicly taken away her character, and she immediately vanished from his house. Seekers after motives could hardly fail to draw an unkind conclusion. But if she came back at once and was seen leading her usual life, the incident was reduced to its true proportions, as the outbreak of a drunken old man furious at being surprised in disreputable company. People would say that Mr. Royall had insulted his ward to justify himself, and the sordid tale would fall into its place in the chronicle of his obscure debaucheries. Charity saw the force of the argument, but if she acquiesced, it was not so much because of that as because it was Harney's wish. Since that evening in the deserted house, she could imagine no reason for doing or not doing anything except the fact that Harney wished or did not wish it. All her tossing, contradictory impulses were merged in a fatalistic acceptance of his will. It was not that she felt in him any ascendancy of character. There were moments already when she knew she was the stronger, but that all the rest of life had become a mere cloudy rim about the central glory of their passion. Whenever she stopped thinking about that for a moment, she felt as she sometimes did after lying on the grass and staring up too long at the sky. Her eyes were so full of light that everything about her was a blur. Each time that Miss Hatchard, in the course of her periodical incursions into the workroom, dropped an allusion to her young cousin, the architect, the effect was the same on Charity. The hemlock garland she was wearing fell to her knees, and she sat in a kind of trance. It was so manifestly absurd that Miss Hatchard should talk of Harney in that familiar possessive way, as if she had any claim on him, or knew anything about him. She, Charity Royall, was the only being on earth who really knew him from the soles of his feet to the rumpled crest of his hair, knew the shifting lights in his eyes, and the inflections of his voice, and the things he liked and disliked, and everything there was to know about him, as minutely and yet unconsciously as a child knows the walls of the room it wakes up in every morning. It was this fact, which nobody about her guessed, or would have understood, that made her life something apart and inviolable, as if nothing had any power to hurt or disturb her as long as her secret was safe. The room in which the girls sat was the one which had been Harney's bedroom. He had been sent upstairs to make room for the home week workers, but the furniture had not been moved, and as Charity sat there she had perpetually before her the vision she had looked in on from the midnight garden. The table at which Harney had sat was the one about which the girls were gathered, and her own seat was near the bed on which she had seen him lying. Sometimes, when the others were not looking, she bent over as if to pick up something, and laid her cheek for a moment against the pillow. Toward sunset, the girls disbanded. Their work was done, and the next morning, at daylight, the draperies and garlands were to be nailed up, and the illuminated scrolls put in place in the town hall. The first guests were to drive over from Hepburn in time for the midday banquet under a tent in Miss Hatchard's field, and after that the ceremonies were to begin. Miss Hatchard, pale with fatigue and excitement, thanked her young assistants, and stood in the porch, leaning on her crutches and waving a farewell as she watched them troop away down the street. Charity had slipped off among the first, but at the gate she heard Allie Hawes calling after her, and reluctantly turned. "Will you come over now and try on your dress?" Allie asked, looking at her with wistful admiration. "I want to be sure the sleeves don't ruck up the same as they did yesterday." Charity gazed at her with dazzled eyes. "Oh, it's lovely," she said, and hastened away without listening to Allie's protest. She wanted her dress to be as pretty as the other girls, wanted it, in fact, to outshine the rest, since she was to take part in the exercises, but she had no time just then to fix her mind on such matters. She sped up the street to the library, of which she had the key about her neck. From the passage at the back, she dragged forth a bicycle and guided it to the edge of the street. She looked about to see if any of the girls were approaching, but they had drifted away together toward the town hall, and she sprang into the saddle and turned toward the Creston Road. There was an almost continual descent to Creston, and with her feet against the pedals, she floated through the still evening air like one of the hawks she had often watched slanting downward on motionless wings. 20 minutes from the time when she had left Miss Hatchard's door, she was turning up the wood road on which Harney had overtaken her on the day of her flight, and a few minutes afterward she had jumped from her bicycle at the gate of the deserted house. In the gold-powdered sunset it looked more than ever like some frail shell dried and washed by many seasons. But at the back, whither Charity advanced, drawing her bicycle after her, there were signs of recent habitation. A rough door made of boards hung in the kitchen doorway, and pushing it open she entered a room furnished in primitive camping fashion. In the window was a table, also made of boards, with an earthenware jar holding a big bunch of wild asters. 2 canvas chairs stood nearby, and in one corner was a mattress with a Mexican blanket over it. The room was empty, and leaning her bicycle against the house, Charity clambered up the slope and sat down on a rock under an old apple tree. The air was perfectly still, and from where she sat she would be able to hear the tinkle of a bicycle bell a long way down the road. She was always glad when she got to the little house before Harney. She liked to have time to take in every detail of its secret sweetness. The shadows of the apple trees swaying on the grass, the old walnuts rounding their domes below the road, the meadows sloping westward in the afternoon light. Before his first kiss blotted it all out. Everything unrelated to the hours spent in that tranquil place was as faint as the remembrance of a dream. The only reality was the wondrous unfolding of her new self, the reaching out to the light of all her contracted tendrils. She had lived all her life among people whose sensibilities seemed to have withered for lack of use, and more wonderful, at first, than Harney's endearments were the words that were a part of them. She had always thought of love as something confused and furtive, and he made it as bright and open as the summer air. On the morrow of the day when she had shown him the way to the deserted house, he had packed up and left Creston River for Boston. But at the first station he had jumped on the train with a handbag and scrambled up into the hills. For 2 golden, rainless August weeks he had camped in the house, getting eggs and milk from the solitary farm in the valley, where no one knew him, and doing his cooking over a spirit lamp. He got up every day with the sun, took a plunge in a brown pool he knew of, and spent long hours lying in the scented hemlock woods above the house, or wandering along the yoke of the Eagle Ridge, far above the misty blue valleys that swept away east and west between the endless hills. And in the afternoon Charity came to him. With part of what was left of her savings, she had hired a bicycle for a month, and every day after dinner, as soon as her guardian started to his office, she hurried to the library, got out her bicycle, and flew down the Creston Road. She knew that Mr. Royall, like everyone else in North Dormer, was perfectly aware of her acquisition. Possibly he, as well as the rest of the village, knew what use she made of it. She did not care. She felt him to be so powerless that if he had questioned her, she would probably have told him the truth. But they had never spoken to each other since the night on the wharf at Nettleton. He had returned to North Dormer only on the 3rd day after that encounter, arriving just as Charity and Verena were sitting down to supper. He had drawn up his chair, taken his napkin from the sideboard drawer, pulled it out of its ring, and seated himself as unconcernedly as if he had come in from his usual afternoon session at Carrick Fry's. And the long habit of the household made it seem almost natural that Charity should not so much as raise her eyes when he entered. She had simply let him understand that her silence was not accidental by leaving the table while he was still eating, and going up without a word to shut herself into her room. After that he formed the habit of talking loudly and genially to Verena whenever Charity was in the room, but otherwise there was no apparent change in their relations. She did not think connectedly of these things while she sat waiting for Harney, but they remained in her mind as a sullen background against which her short hours with him flamed out like forest fires. Nothing else mattered, neither the good nor the bad, or what might have seemed so before she knew him. He had caught her up and carried her away into a new world, from which, at stated hours, the ghost of her came back to perform certain customary acts, but all so thinly and insubstantially that she sometimes wondered that the people she went about among could see her. Behind the swarthy mountain, the sun had gone down in waveless gold. From a pasture up the slope, a tinkle of cowbells sounded. A puff of smoke hung over the farm in the valley, trailed on the pure air, and was gone. For a few minutes, in the clear light that is all shadow, fields and woods were outlined with an unreal precision. Then the twilight blotted them out, and the little house turned gray and spectral under its wizened apple branches. Charity's heart contracted. The first fall of night after a day of radiance often gave her a sense of hidden menace. It was like looking out over the world as it would be when love had gone from it. She wondered if someday she would sit in that same place and watch in vain for her lover. His bicycle bell sounded down the lane, and in a minute she was at the gate and his eyes were laughing in hers. They walked back through the long grass and pushed open the door behind the house. The room at first seemed quite dark and they had to grope their way in hand. Through the window frame the sky looked light by contrast, and above the black mass of asters in the earthen jar, one white star glimmered like a moth. "There was such a lot to do at the last minute," Harney was explaining, "and I had to drive down to Creston to meet someone who has come to stay with my cousin for the show." He had his arms about her, and his kisses were in her hair and on her lips. Under his touch, things deep down in her struggled to the light and sprang up like flowers in sunshine. She twisted her fingers into his, and they sat down side by side on the improvised couch. She hardly heard his excuses for being late. In his absence, 1,000 doubts tormented her, but as soon as he appeared, she ceased to wonder where he had come from, what had delayed him, who had kept him from her. It seemed as if the places he had been in and the people he had been with must cease to exist when he left them, just as her own life was suspended in his absence. He continued now to talk to her volubly and gaily, deploring his lateness, grumbling at the demands on his time, and good-humoredly mimicking Miss Hatchard's benevolent agitation. She hurried off miles to ask Mr. Royall to speak at the town hall tomorrow. "I didn't know till it was done." Charity was silent, and he added, "After all, perhaps it's just as well. No one else could have done it." Charity made no answer. She did not care what part her guardian played in the morrow's ceremonies. Like all the other figures peopling her meager world, he had grown non-existent to her. She had even put off hating him. "Tomorrow I shall only see you from far off," Harney continued. "But in the evening there'll be the dance in the town hall. Do you want me to promise not to dance with any other girl?" Any other girl? Were there any others? She had forgotten even that peril, so enclosed did he and she seem in their secret world. Her heart gave a frightened jerk. "Yes, promise." He laughed and took her in his arms. "You goose, not even if they're hideous?" He pushed the hair from her forehead, bending her face back as his way was, and leaning over so that his head loomed black between her eyes and the paleness of the sky in which the white star floated. Side by side they sped back along the dark wood road to the village. A late moon was rising, full-orbed and fiery, turning the mountain ranges from fluid gray to a massive blackness, and making the upper sky so light that the stars looked as faint as their own reflections in water. At the edge of the wood, 1/2 mile from North Dormer, Harney jumped from his bicycle, took Charity in his arms for a last kiss, and then waited while she went on alone. They were later than usual, and instead of taking the bicycle to the library, she propped it against the back of the woodshed and entered the kitchen of the red house. Verena sat there alone. When Charity came in, she looked at her with mild, impenetrable eyes, and then took a plate and a glass of milk from the shelf and set them silently on the table. Charity nodded her thanks, and sitting down, fell hungrily upon her piece of pie and emptied the glass. Her face burned with her quick flight through the night, and her eyes were dazzled by the twinkle of the kitchen lamp. She felt like a night-bird suddenly caught and caged. "He ain't come back since supper," Verena said. "He's down to the hall." Charity took no notice. Her soul was still winging through the forest. She washed her plate and tumbler and then felt her way up the dark stairs. When she opened her door, a wonder arrested her. Before going out, she had closed her shutters against the afternoon heat, but they had swung partly open, and a bar of moonlight, crossing the room, rested on her bed and showed a dress of China silk laid out on it in virgin whiteness. Charity had spent more than she could afford on the dress, which was to surpass those of all the other girls. She had wanted to let North Dormer see that she was worthy of Harney's admiration. Above the dress, folded on the pillow, was the white veil which the young women who took part in the exercises were to wear under a wreath of asters, and beside the veil, a pair of slim white satin shoes that Allie had produced from an old trunk in which she stored mysterious treasures. Charity stood gazing at all the outspread whiteness. It recalled a vision that had come to her in the night after her first meeting with Harney. She no longer had such visions. Warmer splendors had displaced them. But it was stupid of Allie to have paraded all those white things on her bed, exactly as Hattie Target's wedding dress from Springfield had been spread out for the neighbors to see when she married Tom Fry. Charity took up the satin shoes and looked at them curiously. By day, no doubt, they would appear a little worn, but in the moonlight they seemed carved of ivory. She sat down on the floor to try them on, and they fitted her perfectly, though when she stood up she lurched a little on the high heels. She looked down at her feet, which the graceful mold of the slippers had marvelously arched and narrowed. She had never seen such shoes before, even in the shop windows at Nettleton. Never. Except... Yes, once, she had noticed a pair of the same shape on Annabel Balch. A blush of mortification swept over her. Allie sometimes sewed for Miss Balch when that brilliant being descended on North Dormer, and no doubt she picked up presents of cast-off clothing. The treasures in the mysterious trunk all came from the people she worked for. There could be no doubt that the white slippers were Annabel Balch's. As she stood there staring down moodily at her feet, she heard the triple click-click-click of a bicycle bell under her window. It was Harney's secret signal as he passed on his way home. She stumbled to the window on her high heels, flung open the shutters and leaned out. He waved to her and sped by, his black shadow dancing merrily ahead of him down the empty moonlit road, and she leaned there watching him till he vanished under the hatchered spruces. 13. The town hall was crowded and exceedingly hot. As Charity marched into it third in the white muslin file headed by Orma Fry, she was conscious mainly of the brilliant effect of the wreathed columns framing the green-carpeted stage toward which she was moving, and of the unfamiliar faces turning from the front rows to watch the advance of the procession. But it was all a bewildering blur of eyes and colors till she found herself standing at the back of the stage, her great bunch of asters and goldenrod held well in front of her, and answering the nervous glance of Lambert Saulus, the organist from Mr. Miles's church, who had come up from Nettleton to play the harmonium and sat behind it, his conductor's eye running over the fluttered girls. A moment later, Mr. Miles, pink and twinkling, emerged from the background, as if buoyed up on his broad white gown, and briskly dominated the bowed heads in the front rows. He prayed energetically and briefly and then retired, and a fierce nod from Lambert Saulus warned the girls that they were to follow at once with "Home, Sweet Home." It was a joy to Charity to sing. It seemed as though, for the first time, her secret rapture might burst from her and flash its defiance at the world. All the glow in her blood, the breath of the summer earth, the rustle of the forest, the fresh call of birds at sunrise, and the brooding midday languors seemed to pass into her untrained voice, lifted and led by the sustaining chorus. And then suddenly the song was over, and after an uncertain pause, during which Miss Hatchard's pearl-gray gloves started a furtive signaling down the hall, Mr. Royall, emerging in turn, ascended the steps of the stage and appeared behind the flower-wreathed desk. He passed close to Charity, and she noticed that his gravely set face wore the look of majesty that used to awe and fascinate her childhood. His frock coat had been carefully brushed and ironed, and the ends of his narrow black tie were so nearly even that the tying must have cost him a protracted struggle. His appearance struck her all the more because it was the first time she had looked him full in the face since the night at Nettleton, and nothing in his grave and impressive demeanor revealed a trace of the lamentable figure on the wharf. He stood a moment behind the desk, resting his fingertips against it, and bending slightly toward his audience. Then he straightened himself and began. At first, she paid no heed to what he was saying. Only fragments of sentences, sonorous quotations, allusions to illustrious men, including the obligatory tribute to Honorius Hatchard, drifted past her inattentive ears. She was trying to discover Harney among the notable people in the front row, but he was nowhere near Miss Hatchard, who, crowned by a pearl-gray hat that matched her gloves, sat just below the desk, supported by Mrs. Miles and an important-looking unknown lady. Charity was near one end of the stage, and from where she sat the other end of the first row of seats was cut off by the screen of foliage masking the harmonium. The effort to see Harney around the corner of the screen, or through its interstices, made her unconscious of everything else. But the effort was unsuccessful, and gradually she found her attention arrested by her guardian's discourse. She had never heard him speak in public before, but she was familiar with the rolling music of his voice when he read aloud, or held forth to the selectmen about the stove at Carrick Fry's. Today his inflections were richer and graver than she had ever known them. He spoke slowly, with pauses that seemed to invite his hearers to silent participation in his thought, and Charity perceived a light of response in their faces. He was nearing the end of his address. "Most of you," he said, "most of you who have returned here today to take contact with this little place for a brief hour have come only on a pious pilgrimage and will go back presently to busy cities and lives full of larger duties. But that is not the only way of coming back to North Dormer. Some of us who went out from here in our youth, went out like you to busy cities and larger duties, have come back in another way, come back for good. I am one of those, as many of you know." He paused, and there was a sense of suspense in the listening hall. "My history is without interest, but it has its lesson. Not so much for those of you who have already made your lives in other places, as for the young men who are perhaps planning even now to leave these quiet hills and go down into the struggle. Things they cannot foresee may send some of those young men back someday to the little township and the old homestead. They may come back for good." He looked about him and repeated gravely, "For good. There's the point I want to make. North Dormer is a poor little place, almost lost in a mighty landscape. Perhaps by this time it might have been a bigger place, and more in scale with the landscape, if those who had to come back had come with that feeling in their minds, that they wanted to come back for good, and not for bad, or just for indifference. Gentlemen, let us look at things as they are. Some of us have come back to our native town because we'd failed to get on elsewhere. One way or other, things had gone wrong with us. What we'd dreamed of hadn't come true. But the fact that we had failed elsewhere is no reason why we should fail here. Our very experiments in larger places, even if they were unsuccessful, ought to have helped us to make North Dormer a larger place. And you young men who are preparing even now to follow the call of ambition and turn your back on the old homes, well, let me say this to you, that if ever you do come back to them, it's worthwhile to come back to them for their good. And to do that, you must keep on loving them while you're away from them. And even if you come back against your will, and thinking it's all a bitter mistake of fate or providence, you must try to make the best of it, and to make the best of your old town. And after a while, well, ladies and gentlemen, I give you my recipe for what it's worth. After a while, I believe you'll be able to say, as I can say today, I'm glad I'm here. Believe me, all of you, the best way to help the places we live in is to be glad we live there." He stopped, and a murmur of emotion and surprise ran through the audience. It was not in the least what they had expected, but it moved them more than what they had expected would have moved them. "Hear, hear!" a voice cried out in the middle of the hall. An outburst of cheers caught up the cry, and as they subsided, Charity heard Mr. Miles saying to someone near him, "That was a man talking." He wiped his spectacles. Mr. Royall had stepped back from the desk and taken his seat in the row of chairs in front of the harmonium. A dapper, white-haired gentleman, a distant Hatchard, succeeded him behind the goldenrod and began to say beautiful things about the old oaken bucket, patient, white-haired mothers, and where the boys used to go nutting. And Charity began again to search for Harney. Suddenly, Mr. Royall pushed back his seat, and one of the maple branches in front of the harmonium collapsed with a crash. It uncovered the end of the first row, and in one of the seats Charity saw Harney, and in the next a lady whose face was turned toward him and almost hidden by the brim of her drooping hat. Charity did not need to see the face. She knew at a glance the slim figure, the fair hair heaped up under the hat brim, the long, pale, wrinkled gloves with bracelets slipping over them. At the fall of the branch, Miss Balch turned her head toward the stage, and in her pretty, thin-lipped smile there lingered the reflection of something her neighbor had been whispering to her. Someone came forward to replace the fallen branch, and Miss Balch and Harney were once more hidden. But to Charity the vision of their two faces had blotted out everything. In a flash they had shown her the bare reality of her situation. Behind the frail screen of her lover's caresses was the whole inscrutable mystery of his life, his relations with other people, with other women, his opinions, his prejudices, his principles, the net of influences and interests and ambitions in which every man's life is entangled. Of all these she knew nothing, except what he had told her of his architectural aspirations. She had always dimly guessed him to be in touch with important people, involved in complicated relations, but she felt it all to be so far beyond her understanding that the whole subject hung like a luminous mist on the farthest verge of her thoughts. In the foreground, hiding all else, there was the glow of his presence, the light and shadow of his face, the way his short-sighted eyes, at her approach, widened and deepened as if to draw her down into them, and above all, the flush of youth and tenderness in which his words enclosed her. Now she saw him detached from her, drawn back into the unknown, and whispering to another girl things that provoked the same smile of mischievous complicity he had so often called to her own lips. The feeling possessing her was not one of jealousy. She was too sure of his love. It was rather a terror of the unknown, of all the mysterious attractions that must even now be dragging him away from her, and of her own powerlessness to contend with them. She had given him all she had, but what was it compared to the other gifts life held for him? She understood now the case of girls like herself to whom this kind of thing happened. They gave all they had, but their all was not enough. It could not buy more than a few moments. The heat had grown suffocating. She felt it descend on her in smothering waves, and the faces in the crowded hall began to dance like the pictures flashed on the screen at Nettleton. For an instant, Mr. Royall's countenance detached itself from the general blur. He had resumed his place in front of the harmonium, and sat close to her, his eyes on her face, and his look seemed to pierce to the very center of her confused sensations. A feeling of physical sickness rushed over her, and then deadly apprehension. The light of the fiery hours in the little house swept back on her in a glare of fear. She forced herself to look away from her guardian and became aware that the oratory of the Hatchard cousin had ceased, and that Mr. Miles was again flapping his wings. Fragments of his peroration floated through her bewildered brain. A rich harvest of hallowed memories, a sanctified hour to which in moments of trial your thoughts will prayerfully return. And now, O Lord, let us humbly and fervently give thanks for this blessed day of reunion here in the old home to which we have come back from so far. Preserve it to us, O Lord, in times to come, in all its homely sweetness, in the kindliness and wisdom of its old people, in the courage and industry of its young men, in the piety and purity of this group of innocent girls. He flapped a white wing in their direction, and at the same moment Lambert Saulus, with his fierce nod, struck the opening bars of Auld Lang Syne. Charity stared straight ahead of her and then, dropping her flowers, fell face downward at Mr. Royall's feet. 14. North Dormer's celebration naturally included the villages attached to its township, and the festivities were to radiate over the whole group, from Dormer and the two Crestons to Hamblin, the lonely hamlet on the north slope of the mountain, where the first snow always fell. On the third day there were speeches and ceremonies at Creston and Creston River. On the fourth, the principal performers were to be driven in buckboards to Dormer and Hamblin. It was on the fourth day that Charity returned for the first time to the little house. She had not seen Harney alone since they had parted at the wood's edge the night before the celebrations began. In the interval she had passed through many moods, but for the moment the terror which had seized her in the town hall had faded to the edge of consciousness. She had fainted because the hall was stiflingly hot, and because the speakers had gone on and on. Several other people had been affected by the heat, and had had to leave before the exercises were over. There had been thunder in the air all the afternoon, and everyone said afterward that something ought to have been done to ventilate the hall. At the dance that evening, where she had gone reluctantly, and only because she feared to stay away, she had sprung back into instant reassurance. As soon as she entered, she had seen Harney waiting for her, and he had come up with kind, gay eyes and swept her off in a waltz. Her feet were full of music, and though her only training had been with the village youths, she had no difficulty in tuning her steps to his. As they circled about the floor, all her vain fears dropped from her, and she even forgot that she was probably dancing in Annabel Balch's slippers. When the waltz was over, Harney, with a last hand-clasp, left her to meet Miss Hatchard and Miss Balch, who were just entering. Charity had a moment of anguish as Miss Balch appeared, but it did not last. The triumphant fact of her own greater beauty and of Harney's sense of it swept her apprehensions aside. Miss Balch, in an unbecoming dress, looked sallow and pinched, and Charity fancied there was a worried expression in her pale-lashed eyes. She took a seat near Miss Hatchard, and it was presently apparent that she did not mean to dance. Charity did not dance often either. Harney explained to her that Miss Hatchard had begged him to give each of the other girls a turn, but he went through the form of asking Charity's permission each time he led one out, and that gave her a sense of secret triumph even completer than when she was whirling about the room with him. She was thinking of all this as she waited for him in the deserted house. The late afternoon was sultry, and she had tossed aside her hat and stretched herself at full length on the Mexican blanket, because it was cooler indoors than under the trees. She lay with her arms folded beneath her head, gazing out at the shaggy shoulder of the mountain. The sky behind it was full of the splintered glories of the descending sun, and before long she expected to hear Harney's bicycle bell in the lane. He had bicycled to Hamblin instead of driving there with his cousin and her friends, so that he might be able to make his escape earlier and stop on the way back at the deserted house, which was on the road to Hamblin. They had smiled together at the joke of hearing the crowded buckboards roll by on the return, while they lay close in their hiding above the road. Such childish triumphs still gave her a sense of reckless security. Nevertheless, she had not wholly forgotten the vision of fear that had opened before her in the town hall. The sense of lastingness was gone from her, and every moment with Harney would now be ringed with doubt. The mountain was turning purple against a fiery sunset from which it seemed to be divided by a knife edge of quivering light, and above this wall of flame the whole sky was a pure, pale green, like some cold mountain lake in shadow. Charity lay gazing up at it and watching for the first white star. Her eyes were still fixed on the upper reaches of the sky when she became aware that a shadow had flitted across the glory-flooded room. It must have been Harney passing the window against the sunset. She half raised herself and then dropped back on her folded arms. The combs had slipped from her hair, and it trailed in a rough dark rope across her breast. She lay quite still, a sleepy smile on her lips, her indolent lids half shut. There was a fumbling at the padlock, and she called out, "Have you slipped the chain?" The door opened, and Mr. Royall walked into the room. She started up, sitting back against the cushions, and they looked at each other without speaking. Then Mr. Royall closed the door latch and advanced a few steps. Charity jumped to her feet. "What have you come for?" she stammered. The last glare of the sunset was on her guardian's face, which looked ash-colored in the yellow radiance. "Because I knew you were here," he answered simply. She had become conscious of the hair hanging loose across her breast, and it seemed as though she could not speak to him till she had set herself in order. She groped for her comb and tried to fasten up the coil. Mr. Royall silently watched her. "Charity," he said, "he'll be here in a minute. Let me talk to you first." "You've got no right to talk to me. I can do what I please." "Yes. What is it you mean to do?" "I needn't answer that or anything else." He had glanced away and stood looking curiously about the illuminated room. Purple asters and red maple leaves filled the jar on the table. On a shelf against the wall stood a lamp, the kettle, a little pile of cups and saucers. The canvas chairs were grouped about the table. "So, this is where you meet," he said. His tone was quiet and controlled, and the fact disconcerted her. She had been ready to give him violence for violence, but this calm acceptance of things as they were left her without a weapon. "See here, Charity, you're always telling me I've got no rights over you. There might be two ways of looking at that, but I ain't gonna argue it. All I know is I raised you as good as I could, and meant fairly by you always, except once, for a bad half hour. There's no justice in weighing that half hour against the rest, and you know it. If you hadn't, you wouldn't have gone on living under my roof. Seems to me the fact of your doing that gives me some sort of a right. The right to try and keep you out of trouble. I'm not asking you to consider any other." She listened in silence and then gave a slight laugh. "Better wait till I'm in trouble," she said. He paused a moment, as if weighing her words. "Is that all your answer?" "Yes, that's all. Well, I'll wait." He turned away slowly, but as he did so, the thing she had been waiting for happened. The door opened again and Harney entered. He stopped short with a face of astonishment, and then, quickly controlling himself, went up to Mr. Royall with a frank look. "Have you come to see me, sir?" he said coolly, throwing his cap on the table with an air of proprietorship. Mr. Royall again looked slowly about the room, then his eyes turned to the young man. "Is this your house?" he inquired. Harney laughed. "Well, as much as it's anybody's. I come here to sketch occasionally." "And to receive Miss Royall's visits?" "When she does me the honor." "Is this the home you propose to bring her to when you get married?" There was an immense and oppressive silence. Charity, quivering with anger, started forward, and then stood silent, too humbled for speech. Harney's eyes had dropped under the old man's gaze, but he raised them presently, and looking steadily at Mr. Royall, said, "Miss Royall is not a child. Isn't it rather absurd to talk of her as if she were? I believe she considers herself free to come and go as she pleases without any questions from anyone." He paused and added, "I'm ready to answer any she wishes to ask me." Mr. Royall turned to her. "Ask him when he's going to marry you, then." There was another silence, and he laughed in his turn, a broken laugh with a scraping sound in it. "You darsn't!" he shouted out with sudden passion. He went close up to Charity, his right arm lifted, not in menace but in tragic exhortation. "You darsn't, and you know it, and you know why." He swung back again upon the young man. "And you know why you ain't asked her to marry you, and why you don't mean to. It's because you hadn't need to, nor any other man either. I'm the only one that was fool enough not to know that, and I guess nobody'll repeat my mistake, not in Eagle County anyhow. They all know what she is and what she came from. They all know her mother was a woman of the town from Nettleton that followed one of those mountain fellows up to his place and lived there with him like a heathen. I saw her there 16 years ago, when I went to bring this child down. I went to save her from the kind of life her mother was leading. But I'd better have left her in the kennel she came from." He paused and stared darkly at the two young people, and out beyond them, at the menacing mountain with its rim of fire. Then he sat down beside the table on which they had so often spread their rustic supper, and covered his face with his hands. Harney leaned in the window, a frown on his face. He was twirling between his fingers a small package that dangled from a loop of string. Charity heard Mr. Royall draw a hard breath or two, and his shoulders shook a little. Presently he stood up and walked across the room. He did not look again at the young people. They saw him feel his way to the door and fumble for the latch, and then he went out into the darkness. After he had gone, there was a long silence. Charity waited for Harney to speak, but he seemed at first not to find anything to say. At length, he broke out irrelevantly, "I wonder how he found out." She made no answer, and he tossed down the package he had been holding and went up to her. "I'm so sorry, dear, that this should have happened." She threw her head back proudly. "I ain't ever been sorry, not a minute." No. She waited to be caught into his arms, but he turned away from her irresolutely. The last glow was gone from behind the mountain. Everything in the room had turned gray and indistinct, and an autumnal dampness crept up from the hollow below the orchard, laying its cold touch on their flushed faces. Harney walked the length of the room and then turned back and sat down at the table. "Come," he said imperiously. She sat down beside him, and he untied the string about the package and spread out a pile of sandwiches. "I stole them from the love feast at Hamblin," he said with a laugh, pushing them over to her. She laughed too and took one and began to eat. "Didn't you make the tea?" "No," she said. "I forgot." "Oh, well, it's too late to boil the water now." He said nothing more, and sitting opposite to each other, they went on silently eating the sandwiches. Darkness had descended in the little room, and Harney's face was a dim blur to Charity. Suddenly he leaned across the table and laid his hand on hers. "I shall have to go off for a while, a month or two perhaps, to arrange some things, and then I'll come back. And we'll get married." His voice seemed like a stranger's. Nothing was left in it of the vibrations she knew. Her hand lay inertly under his, and she left it there, and raised her head, trying to answer him. But the words died in her throat. They sat motionless, in their attitude of confident endearment, as if some strange death had surprised them. At length Harney sprang to his feet with a slight shiver. "God, it's damp. We couldn't have come here much longer." He went to the shelf, took down a tin candlestick and lit the candle. Then he propped an unhinged shutter against the empty window frame and put the candle on the table. It threw a queer shadow on his frowning forehead and made the smile on his lips a grimace. "But it's been good, though, hasn't it, Charity? What's the matter? Why do you stand there staring at me? Haven't the days here been good?" He went up to her and caught her to his breast. "And there'll be others, lots of others, jollier, even jollier, won't there, darling?" He turned her head back, feeling for the curve of her throat below the ear, and kissing here there, and on the hair and eyes and lips. She clung to him desperately, and as he drew her to his knees on the couch, she felt as if they were being sucked down together into some bottomless abyss.